Hi guys, in this video we're going to bring together the power of Lottie and ProtoPie to create a circular loading animation. Now I've shown you how to do this in the past completely in ProtoPie, but it gets pretty complicated as you have to use multiple masks and some pretty complex techniques. Some things are just better done using other apps, and we're really fortunate enough to have a whole range of amazing apps to create advanced interactions these days. Creating a circular animation is far easier in apps that support the ability to draw lines along a path. You can do this in After Effects using the Trim Paths feature, but I'm going to create my Lottie animation in the app Lottie Files, as it's a lot easier to use in After Effects and more geared up to product designers. So if we can create a circular animation in Lottie, what do we need ProtoPie for? Well, ProtoPie, as you hopefully know, is a prototyping tool. So I want to prototype using the loader animation to actually load something. And in this case, I'm going to prototype the downloading of a file in a fake streaming app. Okay, enough talking. Let's jump into Lottie Files and get started. Okay, so here I am inside of Lottie Labs. I've already created a new file and I've made my file 26 pixels by 26 pixels. Which you do over here in the right hand corner, and I've also created the duration to be 1 second, and I'll explain as we get further along in the tutorial why it's only 1 second long. Okay, so I want to start by creating my circular loading animation. So I'm going to come over and choose the ellipse tool. I'm going to just tap to kind of just like put down a default ellipse, and I'm going to make this 24 by 24, and I'm just going to center that in the middle of my artboard. I'm going to add a stroke, and I'm going to make the stroke 2 pixels wide. I want to make sure it's aligned to the center, and I'm going to remove the fill. I don't need the fill, and I'm just going to change the stroke color to a green color, and I'm going to choose, I've already pre-chosen a green color, of course, so this kind of really bright green color, that's going to be my loading ring. So that's, as it kind of loads up, it's going to show up in green. So that's good. I'm going to rename this shape layer to loading ring. Okay, that's cool. And I'm going to duplicate this just by using Command D or Control D on Windows. I'm going to call this second ring track. And I'm going to make this white, 100% white. And I'm going to put that underneath. Okay, so we've got 2 ellipses stacked on top of each other, the green loading ring on the top and the white track underneath. Cool. So the next thing I want to do is I want to bring in some icons. So I've just downloaded some icons from Material Design's icon library online, and I've got a arrow icon. So this is an SVG. So I'm just going to drag and drop that in, and you can see that just goes in the center, and you can see that Lottie Files can read SVGs. And I'm just going to change the color of this to white. So I'm just going to twizzle down the arrow SVG to reveal the SVG path, select that, and I'm going to change the fill to white, just so it matches my track. And I'm just going to rename this to take the .svg off. Cool. When the loader is completed, I want to show a check mark. So I've downloaded this second icon, this check mark icon, and I'm going to do essentially the same thing, except this time I'm going to make it the same green as the loading bar. So we're just going to use the eyedropper there, make that the same green, and again just going to rename it a little bit so it matches the others. Okay, let's just put a cap there. Cool. Okay, so we've got our graphics in. So I want to hide the check mark at this point because we only want this to appear at the end. So I'm going to choose my check mark, and I'm just going to change the opacity to 0. Okay, so we're kind of ready to go. The green loading bar is going to animate over time. We're going to sort that out in a minute when we go into animate mode. So you just leave that as it is. But we're kind of all ready to go and start animating this. So the way you get into animate mode in Lottie Files is just to hit this switch. And here we are in animate mode, and you can see I've got this timeline area at the bottom, which I can kind of size up and down. I'm going to make it kind of fairly large so we can see what we're doing. And the first thing I want to do is I want to do the animation of the loading ring. So I'm going to choose my loading ring. So I'm going to select it here, and you can see when I select it, it appears at the bottom. And I've already got a keyframe here, this initial keyframe. So that's basically the current state. I'm going to drag my playhead all the way to the 1 second mark. And I'm going to use a feature inside of Lottie Labs called Reveal Path. And this is the feature that allows us to animate the drawing of a path around this ellipse. So you can see it's currently set at 100% because you can see the whole green. So we're just going to hover over here. You can see there's a little plus icon that's appeared at the 1 second mark. I'm going to tap that. So that's essentially set a keyframe there. I'm going to come all the way back to my first keyframe, select that, and I'm going to change this option called sweep end to 0. Okay, so you can see that the green ellipse has now effectively disappeared. So if I just scrub the playhead here, you can see that as I go through time, in fact, let's just make this a little bit lower. As I go through time, you can see that's animating over 1 second to be completed. Okay, so I don't really like this kind of hard edge, so I'm just going to round that off. So I'm going to come back into my stroke options, into this details option here. And you can see I've got control over how the line's drawn. So I'm just going to choose the round line cap. That's going to round that for me, so that makes it a little bit nicer. So that's literally as easy as it is to create this circular loading animation. Okay. So we've got these other bits, so these icons and things. So we want to kind of like do a little bit of keyframing around those as well. So what I want to happen is when this gets tapped and it starts animating, I want the track, this white track, to go down and be a lower opacity so you can see the green on top. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my track. And again, we've got this now selected and it's got its own set of keyframes. So I'm just going to move up to 1/10 of a second, add a keyframe there, and I'm going to change the opacity of this to 20%. Okay, so you can see it's originally white and now it's gone to 20% of white. Okay, so that's fine. I can leave that as is, and you can see now that the green line is now following that track. So that's all we need to do on the track. The next thing I want to do is I want to be able to show the check mark. So basically the check mark when we're at the 1 second mark. Okay, so I need to select that. And again, it's appeared here and it's already got a keyframe here, you can see, and it's already set to opacity 0. So I'm going to bring this all the way up to, I'm actually going to come up to 0.98 because I've noticed when kind of preparing this that there seems to be an issue when you've got an animation of a certain duration and you go right up to the end of it. So I've got a 1 second animation and it doesn't quite seem to get to the last 10th of a second of the frame. So I need to just kind of pull it in a little bit to make sure that it actually shows. Okay, so I'm going to set this at 0.98 and we're going to add a keyframe. And then we're going to go one more, 0.99, and we're going to add another keyframe. And on this 0.99 keyframe, we're going to up the opacity to 100. Okay, therefore showing our check mark. So you can see here, if I scrub the timeline, it's kind of 0 opacity all the way down from between these two, and then the next frame, it comes in. Okay, so when the check mark comes in, we want the arrow to disappear. So effectively, we have to kind of do the reverse for the arrow. So let's select the arrow. And again, it's got its starting keyframe. We're already on the 99 keyframe, so let's just come back to 0.98. So we want to do exactly the same thing. We want to add a keyframe here, go to 0.99, add another keyframe, and then on this 0.98 keyframe, so on this 0.99 keyframe, we want to change the opacity to 0. Effectively, we want it to disappear. Okay, so let's just scrub that timeline and see how this is all working. So it's starting to animate round, all the way round. And when it gets to the end, it's going to switch. Okay, so you can see that because we're kind of doing it right on like that's like the last tenth of a second. It's not quite making it. That's fine. We can come into all of our loading ring and we can actually move that back to 0.99 because it's all going to stay visible on screen at basically 100, okay, or 1 second. Okay, so that's our animation. Looking good. So we want to export this from Lottie file so we can use inside of our ProtoPie file. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit the export button and we're going to come over to the download Lottie option. And you can see there's our Lottie animation looping. And we're going to give it a name. Let's call it loader. And we're going to hit the download button. Okay, so that's now downloaded to our computer. We can close this down and we're going to go into ProtoPie now and start building the rest of our downloading sequence. So see you there. Okay, so here we are inside of ProtoPie and I've created a fake screen for a mobile streaming app. So we're kind of on the detail view. And you can see here, we've got some controls, we've got a plus button here, and we've got this curious space where I'm going to put my download button. So that's the Lottie file that we've just created. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag and drop that Lottie JSON file that I just downloaded and exported into ProtoPie. So I'm going to drag and drop it down. There you can see I've got my icon, my animation in fact, and you can see it's got the little Lottie icon, so it's a special Lottie layer. I'm going to move this inside of my button download. So I've created a little container for it already. And we're just going to move that to the 0, 0 position. Okay. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the origin point to the center. And that will make sense as we go through the rest of the tutorial. Essentially, as you saw in the demo, we had this kind of little scaling animation. Okay, so that's kind of all ready to go. So to make this work, the first thing I need to do is add a tap trigger. And I want to be able to tap the button download. I'm just going to select that here in the layer. Before I add my tap trigger, that means it gets pre-populated. Okay. And I'm also going to need to use a variable as well. So I'm going to come over to my variables panel here. And I'm just going to create a numeric variable called loader. Okay, back to my tap trigger. I'm going to add an assign response that assigns a value to that variable we just created. So we're going to choose assign. And we're going to choose the loader variable. Cool. And I'm going to add a formula in here. And the formula is going to basically write a value to that loader variable. So let's search for loader. So we want the loader variable. So we're going to take the value of the loader variable that it's already got, and we're going to add 0.01. So 1/100th of a second we're going to add to it. And you may be wondering why we're adding 1/100th of a second. So if you remember, I had told you I was going to explain why our animation was 1 second long. So we've got 1 second of time. We're breaking it down from a decimal perspective into 100 parts. That's so 1/100th of a second. Obviously, you need 100 of those to make 1 second. So we've got 100, basically 100 frames that we can move from 0 to 1 second. So that's why we're adding it at 1/100th of a second. Each 100th of a second is going to represent 1% inside of our loading. Okay. Okay, so we're going to click OK on that. And the next thing we need to do is we need to add a detect trigger. And surprise, surprise, we're going to detect when that loader variable has changed. Okay, so we're starting it all off by hitting the tap, by tapping the button essentially with the tap trigger and assigning that value. That's going to be detected by this detect trigger, and that's going to make all the rest of it work. Okay, so we've detected that something's changed, but we need to know what's changed. We need to kind of run a condition within this. So we're going to add a condition block. And we're going to check to see if the loader variable is less than the value of 1. Obviously, once we get to 1, that's our whole loading complete. So if it's less than 1, we want it to run. Okay. Okay, so if it is less than 1, we want to assign a value. So we're going to add another assign response. We're going to choose our loader variable, and we're going to put another formula in here, essentially the same formula. So we're going to choose our loader variable, and we're going to add 0.01 to it. Okay, and it's going to keep adding 0.01 as long as the condition is less than 1 second. Okay, so essentially as long as the loader variable is less than 1. Okay, cool. Now we want to now control the Lottie file. So Lottie files in ProtoPie work exactly the same as video files. So we just need to add a playback response. So the playback response is going to play the Lottie file, and we're going to choose that Lottie file, which is called loader. Now, but we don't want to play it, because if we just play it, it's going to be 1 second long. It's going to go like in a second. In a second, it's going to be complete. We want actually to step through it frame by frame. Okay, and so what we're going to do is we're going to use the seek option. So the seek will allow us to go to a very specific point in that video, which is essentially, it's not a video, it's a Lottie file, but if you know what I mean, it's going to go essentially to that frame of that Lottie file. Okay, and the frame that we need to go to is going to be held over here in our loader variable. So we need to use our loader variable as the source of where this playback will seek to. So you can see we've got the seek to option here, and it's currently defaulted to the time option. But if we pull down this drop down, you can see we can add a formula in here. So we're going to switch that to formula. And then in the box below, we're going to find our loader variable, and we're going to put that inside of there. Okay. So that's now going to use that to control the playback of that Lottie file. Okay, so we're at a good point here where we can run a test. So let's basically open preview. Let's bring that over here. And I'm going to tap the button and hopefully we'll see something happening. Okay, so there you go. You see I tapped the button, it ran the animation, it went all the way around and it got to the end and then it showed us the tick. Okay. But it was quite fast, right? But that's essentially the nuts and bolts of it. But we're going to do a few more things to this, as you saw in the demo in the beginning of the video, to make it a bit more dynamic. And also I want to show you how you can actually slow down the loading. And you can essentially even what we call throttle the loading. So we can basically mimic a real world situation where it's loading incredibly slowly and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to show you how to do that as well. Okay, but the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add the little bouncy animations and things just to make it a little bit nicer. So we're going to come back to the tap trigger here, and we're going to add a scale response. And we're going to choose the Lottie file, so the loader Lottie file. And if you remember, we set the origin of this to center, so that's the reason why we set it to the center, so that when it scales up and down, it animates from the center. Okay. We're going to scale by a factor, and we're going to, initially we want it to scale down. So we're going to go into make it 90% of its size. And we're going to do that for a duration of 1/10 of a second. And I'm going to change the easing curve here to ease out. Okay. We're going to duplicate this scale to do the next bit of the animation. We're going to set it back to 100. And I'm actually going to choose the default spring easing just to kind of give it a bit of overshoot, a little bit of bounce. And we want to delay this second scale so that it can run after the first scale has run. So you can see we're running the first scale at 1/10 of a second, so we need to delay it also by 1/10 of a second. Okay, so that should basically cover our little initial bounce. Let's just have a look at that. Cool, so you can see really subtle, but you can see there's a little bounce there. Okay, so that's the first part done. The second part that we want to do is when the animation is complete. So we want to kind of do a little bounce animation, a little scaling animation just to kind of accentuate that the loading has finished. Okay, so we're going to effectively copy these two scale responses and we're going to paste them inside of our detect trigger. But we need to add another condition. So we need to check when it's actually loaded, because see this first condition basically says when it's less than 1. So we don't want it bouncing, every single time it's less than 1. So we're going to add another condition here. And we're going to look to see when loader equals 1. And we're going to drag those two scale responses inside that condition. Okay. So when the loader equals 1, we're going to run these scales. And we're going to just change them slightly. So what we're going to do is the first scale is going to be 110%. So it's going to scale up. And the second scale is going to stay at 100%. We're going to just change the curve here to ease. We're going to put this on, let's do it to ease in, I think. Okay, so it's still going to do the ease out, and then it's going to do the ease in. So it's going to be a little bit smoother. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. Let's check that. Open up preview. So we get the first bounce animation and then we get the second bounce animation. So you can see it was a little bit slow there. So that's just, yes, we've got a duration of 0.8, probably left over from the spring, which we don't want. That's very slow. And also we could see that there was some clipping there. So we just need to make this a little bit bigger. Just going to center that again. Okay, let's run that. Oh, it's out of alignment now. Terrible. Let's move that down a bit. Okay, and let's run that. So we get a little bounce, and then we get the little bounce when it's completed. So it just kind of like completes it, just gives it a nice little bit of motion design, a bit of finish to it. But you can see that it's still quite fast, and I promised that I was going to show you how you can actually slow it down and how you can actually throttle it, as I called it. So if we come back, I'm going to come into the detect trigger and specifically the assign response, and we're going to actually add something into this delay. Okay, so we're basically going to delay the assignment of the new value to the variable. And the more we delay it, the slower the animation is going to run. So we're going to delay it by 1/10 of a second. So remember, we're writing this like 100th of a second. We're now slowing it down to only writing 100th of a second, 100th of a second every 10th of a second. Really hard to say. So let's see how that looks. So let's preview that. And we're going to run it. And you can see now it's significantly slower. Kind of feels a bit more realistic, like, especially if you've got really bad internet. And then it kind of eventually gets to the end. And of course, you could slow that down even more. We could do it really bad, like every second. It's going to write 100th of a second every second. And that's going to go even slower. Must be a really big file now. It's probably a lot more realistic in terms of if you was downloading, a streamed show. Okay, so that about brings us to the end of this tutorial. You now have a fully working and portable loader. You could turn this into a component and then you could use it in all sorts of different designs. So you can totally feel free to do that. You could, of course, trigger lots of other things when the loading animation is complete as well. So you could, if you're making it into a component, you could add an event inside of it. So use a kind of like a send and receive trigger. So you could add a send response inside to say, I've finished loading, and then you could capture that inside of your prototype and trigger something else. That brings us to the end of this video on how to create a loader with ProtoPie and Lottie Labs using Lottie. And I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give the video a like. And if you're not subscribed to the channel, it would really help me out if you could subscribe. Most people who are watching my videos aren't subscribers. So let's try and get that subscription up. It just basically helps other people find the channel. So really could do with your help there. So subscribe if you're not already. And hopefully I'll see you next time.